What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? The cold bit through the fabric of his jacket like a small, honest ache. Frost patterned the top of the feed bins, white lace on splintered wood. He could hear his own boots, small deliberate taps, and the barn answered in old dry echoes. Hay sighed in the loft above, a sleepy animal sound. Wind threaded through the gaps in the siding and carried with it the faint, sharp smell of smoke from a distant controlled burn, and beneath that the warm, dusty scent of manure and a life that kept going no matter what we did to it. It was late November, the kind of late where mornings arrive like a question and afternoons fade before you have time to answer. His breath came out as pale ghosts. The light inside the stable was the color of used coins, dim and honest. He moved like a man who had practiced not taking up too much space, hands in pockets, head down. 100 small routines to shield a heart that still felt foreign to him. He had been a firefighter long enough to know how to measure danger, how to count the seconds between a breath and a decision. He had been a man who could steady others with a single measured word. But grief changes the geometry of a body. It rearranges the things you can do without thinking. He found himself standing at the threshold of a stall where a woman used to keep an Arab stallion, a horse with a face that used to tilt toward the sunrise like it was drinking light. He let the door open on its chain and stepped into that smell. Hay, leather, the faint perfume of her shampoo and the saddlecloth she left behind. The stall was larger than most, framed with iron and scarred wood. A coat hung on a peg by the door, one of those bulky things that could hold a person inside it like an apology. He did not take it. He did not touch anything she had touched if he could avoid it. Touch was how memory found him. Memory clung like burrs. He hadn't planned to come that morning. He told himself that repeatedly because plans were how you kept from saying yes to the small betrayals of the heart. He stayed because the landlord called and said the horse, the Arabian, hadn't eaten in 2 days. Because someone had to check. Because that was what he did. Go. He had seen horses before. He had come up on fields when fire calls took the crew out past highways and into the noise of country festivals. But this horse was a shape he did not yet have a name for in himself. He felt the horse before he saw it. The soft exhale of breath against the stall boards, the low, distant clink of a chain, the way the large animal made the small barn settle around it. The stall smelled of the horse's neck, the wild, warm smell of an animal who sleeps outdoors and dreams in grasses. When he stepped closer, the horse lifted its head with the measured slowness of its breed. The face was a little narrow in a way that suggested speed even while standing still. A dished profile, wide expressive eyes that reflected the dim light like dark coins. The ears were small and precise. They turned like tiny radar dishes at the sound of his shoes. The mane was short and fine. The tail carried with that high-set Arab horse's favor, a living banner that twitched now with something like curiosity. He stopped 3 paces away and let the silence do most of the talking. The barn had rules. Close is not near unless the horse says so. He took his hands out of his pockets and kept them in front of him like a man offering both palms to prove he carried nothing sharp. He did not reach. He watched how the horse watched him. There was intelligence there. A slow, attending sort that belonged to animals who read faces for honest cues. The horse breathed, a long, soft draw that fogged the still air. Its nostrils flared and tested him like a reader running a thumb over the spine of a book. An ear flicked. The big eye tracked him with a steady, unblinking calm that could have been mistaken for indifference if you didn't know how attendance sounds in a creature that never pretends. He wanted to remember every small technical thing about that first look. The way the horse's lower lip quivered when it exhaled, the tiny flecks of white on its muzzle where dust had settled, the slow chew it started, as if to prove its jaw still worked. But mostly he noticed how the presence of that animal pressed light against an old, raw space in him, and made it ache in a way that was almost useful. The stable had been hers. She had named the stall after a place they had once visited, a coastline she loved. It was a small, private joke between them, animals who liked the sea without ever seeing it. He had been there for all the lunch-hour visits. He had come once to fix a broken latch and left with his jacket smelling of horse and coffee, and small talk he had not wanted to be as thin as it was. She had been alive then, her laughter like a thing that gave off light. Now she was not. There were technicalities, an accident, a call he had learned to translate without asking. The way the world slid forward without asking permission. He had been at the station when they told him. He had rung the bell to acknowledge the call of duty, because that is what you do when you have learned to move through the loud things. But the story of him was not only around the dispatch. It was stitched with the quiet, domestic details of afternoons and the little way she used to braid the horse's forelock when she thought nobody was looking. He had told himself he would not come back. He had looked at the box of things she left in the back of their truck and put them away in the garage, away being a useful word when you wanted distance. He had promised to be practical, reasonable. He had promised to honor the life they had shared by keeping things tidy. Promise tastes like dust when you finally cross the place where you gave it. The horse shifted weight. One hind foot nudged the straw, then pawed gently at the ground. Not a frantic scrape, but the careful measuring rhythm of an animal, listening for a storm that wasn't there. It snorted once, a soft exhale that made the hairs along its neck vibrate. He felt the sound in his chest like a hand on a piano string. He learned quickly that horses announce themselves not with noise, but with timing. A flick of the ear, a change in the breath, a tilt of the head toward a corner no one had noticed. He moved another step and the horse unfolded an entire new vocabulary. It lowered its head a fraction, eyes half-lidded in an expression he read as assessment. Then it did something small and reckless in the best possible way. It stretched its nose out and touched the edge of his sleeve with the velvet of its muzzle. The sensation was immediate and absurdly intimate. A warm, slow pressure against fabric, the rasp of whiskers like the whisper of a story beginning. He did not know how to name the way his throat shortened. He let his hands hang at his sides. The horse's muzzle stayed a count longer, then retreated. It stepped back, then forward again, persistent in a way that read like patience, not hunger. It sniffed his palm as if it could read the map of him there. Smoke, sweat, the faint metallic tang of adrenaline from years of small violences. The horse had the trader's curiosity of animals who weigh you in smells. He spoke once, not expecting anything, the sound of his own voice rough as untreated wood. "Hey," he said, a single syllable that was both an address and a testing of how the world would answer. The stall hummed with a quiet that felt like permission. The horse moved again, this time closing the short distance and resting the broad, cool weight of its forehead against his knuckles. The touch was heavier than he guessed it would be. He felt the animal's breath warm the skin where his veins ran. For a moment, the world narrowed to the small, accurate fact of the horse's face and the continued, inexplicable softness in his chest. He laughed then, a single, surprised sound that had no mirth in it and everything to do with the surprise of being held by something that refused to let pain be the only shape in the room. The laugh broke like thin glass. He wiped at his eyes with the heel of his hand because men like him learn early that the theater of tears can be private and not always for public sharing. The horse shifted its weight and snuffled at the same sleeve as if to say, "You are messy. You are human. That is enough." There were practicalities. Papers to sign, calls to make, a vet to contact. The farm owed him nothing. He owed the horse perhaps nothing, except the small, stubborn moral arithmetic they had both inherited. Someone had been lost. Something remained. He had meant to leave the horse to the county. He had meant to be reasonable. He had meant to do the things you do when grief is neat on paper. But when he stepped back towards the door, the horse followed like a friend who understands thresholds, not with a clumsy rush, but with the precise, steady gait of its lineage. It placed its hooves in the same rhythm as his own steps. He turned once more and found it at his shoulder, a living question. It blinked slowly, nostrils twitching. The stall light caught in the wet sheen of its eye. There was no decision in the horse's face and only an offering. He stood in the doorway and felt something in him change shape. He did not know why he was still there. He did not know why the animal had chosen to stay close. He only knew the unmistakable private fact that his life had shifted a degree toward the barn. When he pulled the door closed behind him, the chain clicked, and the sound slotted into the space between his ribs like a promise and a warning both. He walked to his truck with the quiet of a man being measured by a new weight at his side. And when he glanced back over his shoulder, the horse had placed its head between the slats and watched him leave. She had taught the horse to wait. He had no idea whether that waiting was for her or for something else. There was a particular smallness to that uncertainty that felt like an invitation. He drove away and kept seeing the curve of the horse's neck in the corner of his vision. He kept feeling the warmth of the muzzle against his hand as if it had been a touch that left a bruise of light. He could not tell himself he had come for the right reasons. He could only admit that he had come. When the truck hummed out onto the main road, the barn settled back into the weather. Hay shifted in the loft. The horse turned its head and watched the road until the last gleam of metal had disappeared. Then it began, slowly, to chew, methodical, measured, and the stable breathed around it like a body returning to its own rhythm. He did not yet know what would happen next. He only knew one very small thing: the animal had followed. And that was not the end of a story. It felt absurdly and painfully like the beginning. He learned the small ways grief kept working on a person long after the immediate hard parts were over. It woke him at odd hours. It sat at the table like a meager guest. It turned practical things into riddles: which bills to pay, what to do with the tack room, whether to feed the horse first or the sadness. The horse had an answer for none of that. It had a body that obeyed weather and appetite and the clock of seasons. It had a habit of showing up where people needed truth. Not the kind wrapped in tidy statements, but the kind that simply existed and waited for someone to notice. The strange behaviors started as small, precise oddities. The horse would lower its head when he passed the old tack trunk where she kept letters. It would stop mid-chew in the stall and listen at the corner where the light hit a crooked nail on the beam. Sometimes when he was alone and tried to be practical about everything, paying the vet, fixing the fence, the horse would stand with its face toward the lane, ears pricked, as if it was expecting someone to walk up the road who never would. He noticed these things because he learned to watch. Watching became a form of speech. He learned the cadence of the animal's attention. Some days it was calm and chewed quietly. Other days it thrummed like a string instrument, restless. Once he said out loud to fill the silence, "She used to whistle when she braided his mane." The horse flinched at the syllables as if it recognized the sound of a voice that belonged to a missing hand. There were reasons for not staying. Firefighters are practical by training. You make decisions in half-breaths and you do not let your life be rearranged by single moments. He told himself that. He told himself that taking the horse for a while was a temporary kindness. He told himself he would find the right home or the right barn. He told himself everything that keeps you from staying when staying is precisely what you need. Then the storm came. It arrived like a fist closing. Rain hit in sheets. Wind took the eaves and looked for something to hold. The old stable was built strong but honest, the kind of building that knew storms and paid rent to them in repairs. He had checked the weather and shrugged off the warnings with the same professional neatness he used at the station. He had replied to the pager, then turned to go check the roof. When the first heavy gust hit, the barn moaned in an old language in a corner of the roof, a section that had already been patched twice. Sighed and gave. He remembers the sound as if it were someone dropping a heavy book. A beam fell the length of the aisle and caught him at the hip as he lunged to push the stall door closed. The fall was instant and unromantic. A crack of timber, the clatter of a feed bin overturned, the sudden terrifying compression of breath. He did not know how long he lay there. There is no good clock for being in pain. Time becomes a thin, sharp thing you have to negotiate one shallow breath at a time. He could breathe if he kept his chest just so. Pain wrote itself across his leg and down the side of him. The beam had landed across his pelvis. Movement brought a hot rain of pain. He tried to call for help and his voice came out as a sound he barely recognized. A small animal sound. The stable smelled of rain and wet wood and the horse's iron-sweet breath. Then the horse did something he had not taught it. It backed up, then surged forward, driving its shoulder against the fallen timber. The animal braced, muscles like coiled rope, and pushed with the full length of its body. He could feel the vibration in his bones. The beam creaked. It shifted enough to give the smallest of angles, enough for him to move an inch and breathe without that knife edge of constriction. The horse did not stop. It tried again and again, stepping back. then coming in with the hard, deliberate force of an animal that had decided the world needed to be different. It used its mouth to grab at the ropes of the halter, clamped them and braced. It snorted, a sharp, fierce sound, and the smell of its breath filled his face. When the beam jutted high enough for his knee to fold, he pushed, felt a new kind of leverage, and with a small, keening sound he found the first inch of freedom. It was the kind of work you do in hospital corridors and in kitchens at dawn, small shifts that, combined, become rescue. But the beam had wedged other things. A pile of stored metal had shifted, quick and ugly, and his phone, already in his jacket, had been crushed. There was no way to call. The rain made every sound muffled. He could not reach a stable window. He was thinking in the blunt logic of someone who knows his own limits. Stay still, conserve energy, do not bleed out. The horse stood over him then, chest heaving, eyes dark and liquid in the low light. It lowered its head and made a sound he would later try to describe and fail, a deliberate, loud exhale that seemed like a command for the world to notice. It ripped at the stall door with its hooves until the latch broke, then charged toward the main gate and began to bang against it with its massive shoulder. It reared once and screamed, a sound not like a human cry but like an alarm. It was wildly practical. It was animal genius. It was a sequence that read like training performed by instinct. Break a barrier, make noise, go where a human might see. Horses sometimes run to the gate to be let out. Sometimes they panic. Sometimes they run the lane. This horse, who had learned patience, used movement as a language loud enough for people to hear. A neighbor answered the noise. He woke to the violent percussion and stepped into his truck, headlights cutting a wake through sheets of rain. He saw the horse at the gate and the way it pawed the ground and brayed into the dark. He saw no man at first, only the beast frantic and urgent. He climbed the mud-slick slope to the stable, calling out into the storm, and then found him with the beam atop his body and the horse like a shield. The neighbor called for an ambulance. Men from the volunteer crew came up the driveway with flashlights and tarps. They lifted the beam with the practiced patience of men who know how to move the heavy things without making them fall faster. They found the small, paper-thin letter he had kept in his pocket, a note that had been shoved into his jacket months before and forgotten. A single folded page with a smudged line of handwriting. Live. Please, wherever you find it. He did not remember reading the entire sentence until they carried him out into the rain. The letter had been warm and sticky from the sweat of previous years. It made him cry then, not from the pain, but from the peculiar and sudden clarity that sometimes comes when your life nearly stops. The horse stood by the stretcher and watched them strap the board around his broken hips like it was guarding a friend it could not lift. At the hospital, when the lights were harsh and the nurses moved with the elegant bleakness of routine, he kept thinking of the horse's face, of that wet, acute breath on his hand. He thought of the way an animal can give the world a new grammar: push, break, make noise, stay. He thought of the letter and the small imperious hope in the word live. He had come to the stable expecting to make arrangements. He had left with the understanding that rescue is not always a human thing. He had left with a belt of bone broken, but not the worst of him. He had left with an animal at the gate and a new kind of debt. Months slid by in the merciless, healing arithmetic of physiotherapy. The world shrank to appointments and measured gains. Friends dropped by and offered casseroles. Others offered silence. He learned to sleep without the immediate presence of someone whose absence had been an ache for too long. The horse came to the hospital on a clear afternoon, led by the neighbor who had found them in the storm. It stood in the small yard and watched him across the glass. He could not walk far then. His legs were still untrustworthy, but when the nurse opened the sliding door and he stepped to the threshold, the horse snorted loudly and the sound seemed to be a punctuation mark. It lowered its head and put its face on the other side of the glass as if to say, "There you are." The distance between them was small in a way that mattered. Time did its slow, faithful work. He learned to walk without the sound of boot tread like a warning. He learned to let the house be a place where laughter could exist again without complaining. He learned to talk about the dead person without feeling like he was betraying something sacred by using their name outside of memory, and the horse, the animal who had pushed timber and called in a storm, grew deeper into the shape of a companion. It learned the exact angle at which he liked his coffee cup warmed. It would stand with its broad flank against his leg as he practiced the small, suspicious exercises the physiotherapist insisted on. as if lending ballast to the unsteady work of walking again. It learned his silence and did not rush it. It learned his first laughter after the hospital and pricked its ears like it had been waiting for a particular sound to come back. Weeks became months. The pieces of the past cooled into a kind of usable pain. He found that he could look at the tack trunk and touch the leather without the walls closing in. He found that when he opened the trunk one afternoon, the horse nudged the lid and, improbably, pressed its nose against a small velvet box hidden under a braid of rope. The box contained a photograph, her smile like sunlight held just at the edge, and a scrap of paper with a time and a place written in her handwriting. It was the very place they'd planned to go but had never gone, a place by the sea. He cried then in the sort of way that was neat and necessary, and the horse stood like a great patient shadow and let him. When the tears stopped, he realized something simple and terrible and beautiful. The life he thought had been taken from him had not been erased. It had been reconfigured. It lay in the small domesticities, the stubborn animal that learned to be his guard, the photograph, the note. It lay in the way he now kept the porch light on when the night came. On the day he finally drove to the place, on the scrap of paper, a wind-battered cove that smelled of salt and was empty but for gulls and a lonely bench. He took the horse with him. They stood together and watched the water move and the light bend. He placed the velvet box on the bench and left it there like an offering. The horse nudged him then, gentle as a confession. It had done everything it could do in the language it knew. It had pushed and screamed and stood. It had become the living answer to the question he had begun with at the barn. What do you do when the only thing left is a horse? You listen. You let yourself be held. You find a way to be alive in handfuls. Sometimes the things that save us are not people who know what to say. Sometimes they are animals who know how to move. If this story touched you, subscribe, leave a comment, follow, and press the bell icon to watch daily videos and enjoy.